Good morning. It is still morning, right? Yes, good morning. And thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your gifts, Wade and Alan and everyone who makes this service possible. It is wonderful to see the community in this room. I think the way you put it, sir, was the best. Good vibrations. I'm definitely feeling those. So, Vietnam and me. I just returned a little over a week ago from Vietnam, and I feel the need to explain just a little bit about how weird it feels for me to say that out loud. First of all, I am not a world traveler. I've flown internationally exactly 3 times now, including this trip. And another trip I took through Emory as a seminary student. And this was a work trip, but certainly not what you would ordinarily think of as a work trip. Because I work in the Emory University Office of Spiritual and Religious Life, also known as University Chaplaincy. Not to be confused with Emory Healthcare's spiritual health departments and chaplaincy programs like our friend Sarah works in. We work primarily with students, but we serve the entire campus community, faculty and staff and students, both graduate students and undergraduate students. And I got involved in this office back when I was a student at Candler because I was interested in interfaith work. That was a big part of what drew me to study theology and particularly to come to Atlanta, where the diversity of faith is so rich and just a whole new world compared to Salt Lake City, Utah. Let's just leave it at that. Emory's chaplaincy office has a rich history of interfaith engagement. For over 40 years, they've had a very deep commitment to pluralism. And there are 2 programs that have existed through this office for one of them will celebrate 40 years this year, and I think the next one will be a year or 2 away. But those 2 programs, one is the Interreligious Council, which is an undergraduate group of representatives from all kinds of faith groups on campus that meets weekly. And this is the group that I have the most experience with. The other program that's been going for almost 40 years is called Journeys of Reconciliation. And this is a program where they have been, for 40 years this coming year, they have been taking multi-faith groups of students, faculty, and staff to different places around the globe that have experienced a deep rupture of some sort, either a war, civil unrest, the dismantling of apartheid. So they've been to quite a few places, including South Africa, Northern Ireland, Cuba, etc. And this year's trip to Vietnam, which literally happened the same day as graduation. So everybody flew out on May 11th. This journey to Vietnam drew over 80 applicants among students, out of which 12 students were chosen. And they, along with the 4 group trip leaders, who included 1 alumni from Vietnam, 1 faculty member who teaches Buddhism, our Buddhist chaplain, and the Dean of Religious Life, had been meeting regularly for months to prepare for this trip. And then, 3.5 weeks before takeoff day, they learned that the Buddhist chaplain could not get a visa to Vietnam, which was a big lesson in the privilege of holding a U.S. passport, by the way. So he couldn't go. And suddenly they needed a 4th leader. And my boss came to me and said, would you be interested in going to Vietnam? And like I said, I have not traveled. I have certainly never been to Asia. I didn't know what the words jet lag meant. I also didn't know, I'm trying to think of the kindest way to myself to say this, but I am allergic to humidity. My acclimation to Atlanta has not been easy. I am a desert girl. You will notice that I am carrying a fan at all times. And it's a nice, cool Sunday today. So you can imagine being in a tropical country like Vietnam for 11 days. But I didn't see how I could say no to this opportunity to have an expenses paid, for the most part, trip around to the other side of the world. Now, it's kind of my motto, like, say yes if the adventure that is being presented to you is at least reasonably safe. And it felt like going with a group of people, this would be reasonably safe. Of course, I underestimated the dangers of crossing the road in Saigon, but that is another story. So in order to prepare to go on this trip during that 3-week window between when I got my visa and when I was going to take off, I tackled as much of the recommended reading and viewing list as I could, including watching all 18 hours of Ken Burns' documentary on the Vietnam War. Shout out to my sweet husband who watched all 18 hours with me. Now, I was born in 1971. So the war did not have a direct impact on my life that I can remember. But it did cast sort of a shadow over the world at that time. Pre-fall of the Soviet Union, the existence of people in my dad's generation who served and were suffering with some of the PTSD and other consequences. But I really had this sort of vague understanding that the war was a bad thing. But that's really about all before I watched this documentary. And after learning more about the US's involvement in Vietnam, I really wondered what it would be like to be an American on the streets of Vietnam, a walking reminder of the harm and mistakes that had been made on all of our behalf by our country. To say that I was scared would be an understatement. So our visit began in Saigon, which is interchangeable with saying Ho Chi Minh City, but it seemed like lots of people said Saigon. And our itinerary that the leaders had worked on with a tour agency for months was a blend of standard tourist attractions plus some special religious sites that maybe other tourists wouldn't be interested in, like the one and only mosque in Hanoi. We went there. And then some educational opportunities around reconciliation that a normal tourist wouldn't be able to experience. One of those was visiting the U.S. consulate in Saigon, which was the site of the U.S. embassy that was eventually evacuated in 1975. So, because of the variance in the kinds of activities we were engaging in, it was kind of like emotional whiplash a little bit. Going from things where everyone was happy and shopping to going to memorial sites that I'll talk about a little bit more. And it didn't help that it was so hot, I didn't think my brain was working properly. which made it very difficult to think about preaching about the experience when I couldn't even process the experience when I was in it. But we started out our trip with sort of an environmental visit to the Mekong Delta. And we were ferried on boats throughout different canals. We visited farms. We were able to taste chocolate grown right there in the Mekong Delta. And it was really, it was sort of impactful to see how close to the land these folks were living. And our tour guide was very insistent on the fact that ecology is a huge priority for the Vietnamese government, and that recycling and reusing, that nothing goes to waste. He showed us all the different ways in which the byproducts of coconut farming are used. Everything from bowls made out of coconut shells to compost to roofs being thatched, etc. But then, when we got on our bus and went back to the city, our next stop was the Thich Quang Duc Monument. Thich Quang Duc is the monk who set himself on fire in the intersection in Saigon in 1963. He set himself on fire to draw attention to the whole world about the repression of Buddhists under the Catholic controlled government. And it was a big, my understanding from the Ken Burns documentary, is that it really was a turning point for people to see that happen and realize that we might not be siding with the good guys in Vietnam if they were repressing people so badly that people were willing to set themselves on fire. The next morning, we started our day at the US consulate, where we got to meet 3 individuals. The first one was the vice consul, the deputy consul, who was quick to tell us that the USA has an 80% approval rating among the Vietnamese. I think I had to pick my jaw up off the floor a little bit. I mean, people had been exceptionally friendly. And I figured it's just because they love those tourist dollars coming in, right? Do they really mean it? What she explained to us is that Vietnam, unlike the United States, has survived multiple occupations and wars prior to the Americans ever coming. They had the French for nearly 100 years, directly prior to the Americans' involvement. They had been occupied by the Mongols, by the Chinese, by the Japanese, and other warring clans within the peninsula itself. So in her mind, that 80% approval rating, which I gotta say, that's gotta be higher than Americans themselves have of the United States right now. Her explanation was that, that this was a very forgiving people, and that really the US involvement was kind of a blip in their history that they really didn't want to dwell on. I really didn't know what to do with that after watching the Ken Burns documentary and reading a couple of books, which admittedly is a very small amount of information, but I felt like I wanted to walk up to each person and apologize, right? But they didn't want that. They didn't want that from me. How do I learn about reconciliation in a place where the reconciliation isn't desired? This was one of my first questions for myself that I encountered on the second day. What does a journey of reconciliation look like when the people there think the reconciliation has already happened? Okay. We went directly, another interesting note at the US consulate we met with a political officer whose job it is to work with the government of Vietnam around sensitive issues like religious freedom. That's why they brought him in to talk to our interfaith group, because most of the people in our interfaith group would not be free to practice their religion in Vietnam. They do allow religious expression, but every religious group has to be registered with the government, and the government has to be a part of decisions regarding leadership. So the first thing I did, of course, was look up Mormon Church in Vietnam. Because of course there are Mormon missionaries in Vietnam. I have no idea how they are a registered group, but the other groups that he was talking about were not, which included people like Methodists, Jehovah's Witnesses, other groups that I don't think of as being very different from the LDS Church, but I digress. Last but not least, we met with the historian of the post, who took us on a tour of the grounds and showed us where the building was, where the helicopters took off from, showed us where the wall was breached, etc. But I think the most impactful thing he told us about was a particular photograph. And I think that if you've ever watched or learned about the Vietnam War, you have seen this photograph. And it is the photograph of a North Vietnamese tank rolling through the fence into the imperial gates of the southern Vietnamese government. And he told us that that photograph was staged, that those gates had been wide open. The people who had worked and lived there had abdicated and not even locked the gates when they left. But you'll see that picture everywhere. From Saigon, we continued our way north. We got to see a bit of the middle part of the country. We flew to Da Nang and went to Hue and Hoan. And those were really also impactful pieces of the trip, but I kind of want to fast forward us to Hanoi when we get to Hanoi. Because when we got to Hanoi, the first thing we did that morning was go to Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum, the memorial to Ho Chi Minh, and it happened to be on his birthday, May 19th. No one planned it this way. In fact, this was actually on our agenda originally for the day before. But we got there, and there were groups of school children everywhere. There was a line that would rival any of the longest lines you've ever seen at Disneyland. But it just kept moving, There were huge groups of students in uniforms, and then there were groups of people from different rural areas wearing traditional costume and singing their songs and doing their dances in honor of Ho Chi Minh's birthday. It was this amazing experience, but also probably one of the weirdest things I have ever done. There were soldiers everywhere. And as you wound your way around towards this memorial, I really didn't know what to expect. Someone said to me that Ho Chi Minh was mummified and was in there. And I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. So we'll be looking at a mummy. But when we actually went through the mausoleum, it was a big glass box with his body preserved in the middle of the room. And our special line just kept moving so that we all could, people around me were crying, bowing, expressing their gratitude to this man that they believe gave them freedom. One of my students made the mistake of taking his phone out of his pocket and was immediately detained by a guard and pulled off into a side interrogation room. They opened up his phone. They checked to make sure that he didn't have any photographs of inside the mausoleum. They even checked his hidden and deleted files on his phone to make sure that he didn't have any. And luckily, he didn't. He had not taken any photos. Therefore, they let him go. But I think it was an eye-opening experience for all of my students to see the level of control over this narrative, over this person, what they were allowed to do, express, experience was completely under someone else's control. And I don't think that these young folks who did not grow up during the Cold War understood so viscerally what an authoritarian regime might be like until that moment. Now, there's a whole lot more I could tell you about. We had lots of adventures. And I really didn't apologize to anyone except our tour guide about the stragglers who wanted to shop in every single place we went. But when I reflect on the purpose of this trip, about reconciliation, I come away with a lot more questions than answers. Typical. The first question for me was, whose reconciliation are we concerned with? As far as the US-Vietnamese reconciliation, the unanimous assertion, both from individuals we talked to and the museums we went into, including the museum on the prison site of the Hanoi Hilton, the Ho Lo prison, the unanimous answer seemed to be that that had already happened, that veterans like John McCain and John Kerry and others had already made that happen. And that normalizing relations with Vietnam in the 1990s repaired any lingering issues with the United States. But then, besides whose reconciliation we need to take a closer look at why reconciliation is needed at all, which leads to the question of whose narrative are we receiving about a conflict? Any conflict. One visit in particular provided a stark example of this for me. We went to a place called the War Remnants Museum, which was renamed. It used to be called the U.S. and Puppet Regime War Atrocities Exhibition House. After relations were improved between the United States and Vietnam, they changed it to the War Remnants Museum, and there are replicas of all kinds of military equipment that the U.S. brought to Vietnam. An interesting thing, there was a whole floor dedicated to Agent Orange, and an entire wing of that floor dedicated to photographs and stories of individuals who are dealing with, to this day, the effects of Agent Orange. But there were also stories about America's involvement in Vietnam. And in all of the writing that I read, they referred to the Southern Vietnamese government as simply puppets who had no will of their own. And they highlighted in multiple places the amount of money and weaponry supplied by the United States. But it's funny. I didn't see any mention of the amount of money and weaponry that was provided by China and the Soviet Union to the northern side. So what about the narrative that they're receiving? And then there was the Ho Lo prison, what is commonly known, I think, to most of us, would be the Hanoi Hilton. I wasn't really too sure what we were getting ourselves into visiting this place. But it turns out that this prison complex had been built at the turn of the century. So they estimate between 1896 and 1901 was when this prison complex was built by the French in order to punish dissidents, people who were agitating for independence from the colonial rule of France. And as we went through the museum, that was the entire narrative. I was beginning to wonder if the war with the Americans was even going to be mentioned. They talked about all kinds of famous freedom fighters that had been tortured by the French. It wasn't until we got to the very last room that there was a display about American prisoners of war being kept there. And y'all, I wish I could have taken pictures of the displays. They showed a whole lot of happy, chess-playing, Thanksgiving dinner-eating prisoners of war. Whose narrative is telling us about this conflict? That familiar saying about history being written by the victors felt very salient at that moment. And of course, the story of reconciliation between countries and governments that exist on essentially like completely opposite sides of the planet is one thing. When we heard from the consulate employees who actually live in Saigon about the continuing, delicate dance they do, balancing the benefit of our countries being friendly with the concerns about human rights violations. And of course, our group specifically heard about religious freedom issues. It's one thing to talk about that because that's very tied to economics. What I want to know now is about the reconciliation between people in Vietnam. What about the Southern and Northern Vietnamese? What can be done to mend those relationships? And is there even the ability to tell the truth about what happened between those groups under a controlling regime that insists that now, finally, Vietnam is a unified, made great again country? Before the trip, our alumna leader, Lynn, shared with us that she has a Northern Vietnamese accent because her mother was raised in the North. And that because of that, here in the United States, where most of the immigrants were South Vietnamese, people are instantly afraid of her. They think that she represents those awful, mean communists that put their loved ones in re-education camps. And then I watched our guide, who came from a rural Vietnamese village in the center of the country, where the fighting was the worst between the Viet Cong and ARVN and all of the parties. I watched his face as we listened to a woman speak at a very special temple on an estate that had been in her family for 22 generations. This was outside Way, and she talked about her grandparents' mistreatment and imprisonment by the North Vietnamese army as it progressed south, even though her parents were heroic spies for the Viet Cong. I wonder about our guide. I wondered about his feelings in that moment. I wondered how his family had been hurt. And I wondered what he would have told us if he had the freedom to tell us what had happened to his own family. Because he was not going to go there with us. That clearly was not part of his job. But all of this made me wonder about reconciliation here in our home. How do we reconcile with the things in our history? Do we have any reason to question reconciliation somewhere else when there are so many things that need to be reconciled here? I gotta say, most people I told that we were going on a journey of reconciliation asked me, where in the United States are we gonna go next? I think that ultimately is the gift that this trip gave me. A reminder to take a close look at the things around myself and apply the same questions that emerged for me in Vietnam. Whose narrative are we hearing? Whose voice is missing? How do we even get down to the truth of a conflict? Which takes me back to probably my favorite part of the entire trip. And that was a visit outside of Hue to Thich Nhat Hanh's Root Monastery. This is where he began his journey as a monk when he was 16, and where he returned and spent the last 4 years of his life. There was something about that place. We saw a lot of beautiful stuff, but nothing struck me like this monastery. And I think that because of the peace and beauty that just enveloped this whole place, I want to carry that with me. So I came away with one goal that's specifically tied to Thich Nhat Hanh as far as reconciliation in my own life goes. I'm quoting him from an interview he did with Oprah, of all people. He said, "Deep listening is the kind of listening that can help relieve the suffering of another person. You can call it compassionate listening. You listen with only one purpose, to help him or her empty their heart. Even if they say things that are full of wrong perceptions, full of bitterness, you are still capable of continuing to listen with compassion." And then he goes on, "Deep listening helps us to recognize the existence of wrong perceptions in the other person and wrong perceptions in ourselves. The other person has wrong perceptions about himself and us. And we have wrong perceptions about ourselves and the other person." He then goes on to talk about terrorists who believe that the other group is trying to destroy them as a religion, as a civilization. So they want to abolish us, to kill us before we kill them. The anti-terrorists think the exact same way, that these are terrorists who are trying to eliminate us and we must eliminate them first. Both sides are motivated by fear, by anger, and by the wrong perception. But wrong perceptions cannot be removed by guns and bombs. They can be removed by deep listening, compassionate listening, and loving space. That, my friends, is what I took away about reconciliation. We need more deep listening, more compassionate listening, and more loving space. May we strive towards this always. Thank you.